"You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife is twice the woman you ever were." My son Daniel said those words across the lunch table as casually as if he were commenting on the weather, and for a moment the entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. The clink of silverware faded, a waitress paused beside another table holding a glass of iced tea, and I felt several pairs of eyes quietly drift in our direction. Daniel sat back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking satisfied with himself, while Claudia Bennett, the woman he had recently started calling family, tilted her head slightly and gave a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin beside my plate and looked at my son the way mothers sometimes look at children when they realize something important has just changed forever. The restaurant smelled faintly of grilled steak and warm bread, the kind of comforting smell that used to remind me of family dinners years ago when Daniel was young and eager to tell me about his school day. Back then he used to sit across from me at our kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, swinging his feet because they were still too short to reach the floor. Now he was 42 years old, dressed in a tailored navy jacket, speaking to me like I was a stranger who had somehow wandered into his afternoon plans. I took a slow sip of water before placing the glass back down carefully, making sure it didn't make a sound against the table. "If that's how you feel," I said quietly, my voice calm enough that even I was surprised by it, "then I suppose you've said what you came here to say." Daniel rolled his eyes as if my response bored him. Claudia reached for her salad and continued eating, her polished silver bracelet catching the light from the window beside our table. It was early afternoon, sunlight pouring across the hardwood floor, the kind of warm Midwestern spring day that usually made people feel hopeful. But I had lived long enough, 68 years, to be exact, to know that sometimes clarity arrived in moments like this, not with shouting or tears, but with stillness. Daniel leaned forward again, lowering his voice slightly, though not enough to keep nearby diners from hearing. "You should accept reality, Mom. Dad moved on. And honestly, Claudia has been more supportive to me in a year than you've been in decades." I nodded once, slowly. That sentence told me more than he realized. Across the table, Claudia finally looked directly at me, studying my face as if she expected anger or humiliation. Instead, she found nothing but a quiet expression and a woman who had already begun thinking several steps ahead. I reached for my purse, sliding it onto my shoulder as I stood. The chair legs brushed softly against the floor. "Thank you for lunch," I said. I left enough cash on the table to cover my meal, because habits formed over a lifetime are hard to break. Daniel didn't try to stop me. As I walked toward the restaurant door, the bell above it chimed softly when I pushed it open, and the warm Ohio air greeted me outside. The parking lot shimmered slightly in the afternoon sun, rows of cars stretching toward the street, where traffic moved lazily past the strip of shops. I paused beside my sedan for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. My son thought this conversation was the end of something. In truth, it was only the beginning. Because Daniel had no idea that a week from that very afternoon, he would be sitting in a very different room, listening to a very different set of words, and by the time that meeting ended, he would finally understand exactly what his mother was worth. I drove home slowly that afternoon, letting the quiet hum of the engine fill the space where conversation used to exist. The road back to my neighborhood wound through familiar streets lined with maple trees just beginning to show their spring leaves, and for the first time in many years I noticed how peaceful the drive felt when I was alone with my thoughts. My house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Columbus, Ohio, the same brick home my late husband Robert and I had moved into more than 30 years earlier when Daniel was still in elementary school. Back then the yard had been full of bicycles, basketballs, and the sound of a boy who believed his mother could solve every problem in the world. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the ignition, sitting for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel as the memory of the restaurant faded into the background. The front porch looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White railing, a rocking chair Robert had built himself, and a small flower pot filled with yellow daisies that I watered every morning before coffee. From the outside, nothing had changed. But something inside me had shifted quietly and completely. I stepped inside the house and placed my purse on the hallway table where it had sat for years. The air carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner and fresh laundry, small signs of the routine I had kept since Robert passed away the previous year. Losing him had been the hardest moment of my life. But even then Daniel had stood beside me at the funeral, his hand resting on my shoulder as if he understood what family meant. Somewhere along the way that understanding had disappeared. I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle with water, setting it on the stove the way I always did when I needed time to think. Robert used to say that the sound of boiling water had a way of slowing the world down. While the kettle warmed, my eyes drifted toward the framed photograph on the counter. Robert stood in that photo with his arm around Daniel when he was about 12 years old, both of them smiling under the bright summer sun at Lake Erie. Robert had always believed in preparation. He believed a man should take care of the people he loved long after he was gone. That belief had shaped many quiet decisions during the last years of his life. Decisions Daniel never paid much attention to because he assumed everything would always fall neatly into his hands. The kettle began to whistle softly, and I poured hot water into a mug with a tea bag resting at the bottom. The steam curled upward as I carried the cup into the living room and sat in Robert's old armchair beside the window. Outside, the neighborhood was calm. A neighbor walked her golden retriever down the sidewalk, and somewhere in the distance a lawn mower started up, the steady buzz drifting through the afternoon air. It would have looked to anyone passing by like an ordinary, peaceful day in a quiet Midwestern neighborhood. But my mind had already moved forward several steps. Beyond the restaurant, beyond Daniel's words, beyond the expression Claudia had worn while she watched him speak. I had seen that expression before in business meetings when Robert dealt with people who believed they understood the situation better than they actually did. Confidence built on incomplete information has a way of collapsing quickly. I took another sip of tea and set the cup on the small wooden table beside the chair. A week. That was how long it would take before certain conversations happened, before certain documents were placed on a polished conference table, before Daniel finally realized that the story he believed about his mother had never been accurate. For now the house remained quiet, sunlight stretching across the living room carpet. The same home where I had raised my son to believe that patience was sometimes the strongest form of strength. And patience, I had learned over 68 years of life, often reveals the truth faster than anger ever could. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm that had defined my mornings for years. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window at exactly 7:15, stretching across the oak table where Robert and I used to share breakfast before he left for work downtown. I poured a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the street slowly come to life. A delivery truck rolled past, a neighbor backed out of his driveway, and the world moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. Yet inside my mind, pieces of a much larger picture had begun to settle into place. Daniel believed he understood the situation. That belief was the first mistake. My phone rang just after 8 o'clock. The name on the screen made me pause for a moment before answering. Thomas Reed had been Robert's attorney for nearly 20 years, a careful man with gray hair and the steady voice of someone who measured every word. Robert trusted him completely, which meant I trusted him as well. "Good morning, Margaret," he said in his calm, familiar tone. "I hope I am not calling too early." I assured him the timing was fine, though something about the quiet seriousness in his voice made me walk slowly into the living room before continuing the conversation. Thomas did not waste time with small talk. He explained that he had been reviewing several documents connected to Robert's estate, and there were details he felt I should discuss in person. His choice of words was deliberate, not urgent, but important. I asked if something was wrong. Thomas paused briefly before answering. "Nothing is wrong," he said carefully. "But there are certain provisions Robert asked me to protect until the appropriate time." Robert had always been like that. Thoughtful. Strategic. Even in the final years of his life when his health began to decline, he spent long evenings reviewing financial records and updating paperwork with the same quiet determination that built his construction company from a small local business into one of the most respected firms in Central Ohio. After we ended the call, I remained seated in Robert's armchair for several minutes, the phone resting in my hand as I considered everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Daniel's voice at the restaurant replayed clearly in my memory, along with Claudia's small, confident smile. I could almost hear the certainty in their assumptions. They believed I was simply an aging widow living quietly in a house that would soon belong to them. That assumption was the second mistake. Later that afternoon I drove downtown to meet Thomas at his office on High Street, a building Robert and I had visited many times over the years. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, the same steady professional atmosphere that had always reassured Robert when important decisions needed to be made. Thomas greeted me warmly and guided me into his office where a thick folder rested neatly on the conference table. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me with the thoughtful expression of someone confirming a long-expected moment had finally arrived. Robert believed in planning ahead, Thomas said gently, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved. He then turned the folder slightly in my direction, revealing several documents with Robert's unmistakable signature. At that moment, I understood something Daniel had never taken the time to learn about his father. Robert Hayes did not leave loose ends. And whatever those papers contained, they had been waiting quietly for exactly the right moment to surface. Thomas opened the folder slowly and turned the first document toward me with the same careful precision Robert had always respected in his work. The paper was thick and official, the kind that carried weight long before anyone read the words printed on it. I leaned forward slightly, recognizing Robert's signature near the bottom of the page immediately. Even after a year, the sight of his handwriting brought back the steady presence he had carried through every chapter of our lives. Thomas rested his hands lightly on the table and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Robert updated several parts of his estate plan about 18 months before he passed away, he explained. He was very clear that these instructions were not to be discussed unless certain circumstances developed. I listened quietly, letting the meaning settle in the room between us. Robert had never been impulsive. Every decision he made came from observation, patience, and a quiet understanding of people. Thomas slid another document forward. This one outlined a structure I had only partially known about before. Robert had created a trust that held the majority of his company's shares, along with the house and several investment accounts. Daniel had always assumed he would eventually inherit everything directly. But the documents on the table described something far more deliberate. The trust placed all control in my hands for as long as I wished to keep it. Only after my passing would the remaining assets be distributed according to Robert's final conditions. I studied the pages carefully, remembering evenings when Robert had sat at the dining table reviewing paperwork while Daniel watched television in the next room. At the time, I believed Robert was simply organizing things for the future. Now it became clear he had been preparing for possibilities he never fully explained. Thomas spoke again, choosing his words with quiet care. There is another clause Robert asked me to emphasize if the time ever came, he said. He turned to the final section of the document and tapped gently near a paragraph halfway down the page. The wording was precise. Robert had written that any heir who demonstrated clear disrespect, manipulation, or pressure toward me regarding the estate would immediately lose all rights to direct inheritance. Instead, those assets would be transferred to a charitable foundation Robert had quietly established years earlier to support vocational scholarships for young construction apprentices across Ohio. For a moment the room felt completely still. Outside the window traffic moved along High Street as usual, but inside the office the quiet weight of Robert's foresight filled every corner. I could almost hear his voice explaining it in the calm way he used when describing a project blueprint. He had not been trying to control the future. He had simply been protecting the people he believed deserved loyalty. Thomas leaned back slightly and folded his hands. Robert trusted your judgment, Margaret, he said. The authority to enforce this clause belongs entirely to you. I nodded slowly, my eyes moving once more across the lines Robert had signed. Daniel's words from the restaurant echoed faintly in my memory, but they no longer carried the same sting they had the day before. Instead, they felt like confirmation of something Robert had already anticipated. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it for a moment. The path forward was becoming clearer with every passing minute. Daniel and Claudia believed the story was simple. They believed time and pressure would eventually bring me to their side of the table. But Robert had built our life on a different principle entirely: preparation. And as I sat there in the quiet office holding the documents he had left behind, I understood that the next chapter of this story had already been written long before Daniel raised his voice across that lunch table. I left Thomas Reed's office with the folder carefully tucked inside my purse, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across High Street as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The city moved around me with its usual steady rhythm. People crossing intersections, cars rolling past the courthouse, the distant hum of construction equipment echoing through downtown Columbus. Robert would have liked that sound. He always said the sound of building meant the future was still moving forward. I paused beside my car for a moment before unlocking the door, letting the weight of everything I had just learned settle quietly in my mind. Robert had not simply left behind instructions. He had left behind protection. And now the responsibility for how that protection was used rested entirely with me. When I returned home, the house greeted me with the same calm stillness it always carried in the afternoon. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in the hallway, and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock reminded me how quietly time moves when no one is watching it. I placed the folder on the dining table where Robert and I used to sit in the evenings reviewing paperwork together. For a long moment, I simply looked at it without opening it again. The documents inside represented decades of work, careful planning, and the quiet trust Robert had always placed in my judgment. That trust mattered more to me than anything Daniel believed he understood about worth. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, leaning lightly against the counter while my thoughts moved back to the restaurant the day before. Daniel had spoken with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Claudia had watched with the calm expression of someone who expected that confidence to pay off. What neither of them realized was how little they actually knew about the foundation Robert had built beneath our family's life. I carried the glass into the living room and sat down in the same armchair where Robert used to read the newspaper each evening. The quiet comfort of the room wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. Outside the front window, a pair of children rode bicycles down the street, their laughter drifting through the warm air as they raced toward the corner. For a moment, I thought about Daniel at that age, pedaling his small red bicycle along this very sidewalk while Robert jogged beside him, offering steady encouragement. Robert believed patience was the strongest form of discipline a person could learn. He practiced it in business, in family, and in every decision he made about the future. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, studying the screen for a moment before scrolling to Daniel's contact. My finger hovered there briefly. There was no anger left in me now, only clarity. The events of the past 2 days had revealed exactly where every person in this story stood. Finally, I pressed the call button. Daniel answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the faint background noise of traffic and conversation as if he were walking somewhere downtown. "Mom?" he said, sounding slightly surprised. I kept my tone steady and calm, the same tone Robert used whenever he discussed serious business matters. I told him that I had been thinking about our conversation at lunch and that perhaps it would be best if we all sat down together to discuss the future. I mentioned that it might be helpful for Claudia to join us as well. Daniel hesitated for a second before agreeing, curiosity clearly rising behind his words. I suggested we meet the following week at Thomas Reed's office so that everything could be discussed clearly and professionally. When the call ended, I set the phone back on the table beside me and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow path across the neighborhood, lighting the same house where Robert and I had spent decades building a life rooted in patience and foresight. Daniel believed the conversation we had just scheduled would secure the future he expected. But as I looked once more toward the folder resting quietly on the dining table, I understood something he did not. The real conversation had already been written long before that phone call was ever made. The days leading up to the meeting moved quietly, almost peacefully, as if the world itself had decided to slow down and give me time to think. I kept my usual routine, watering the flowers on the porch each morning, walking through the grocery store on Thursday afternoon the way I had for years, and sitting in Robert's armchair each evening while the sun slipped behind the row of maples across the street. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different. But inside, every small moment carried the steady awareness that something important was approaching. Daniel called once during the week to confirm the meeting. His voice sounded lighter than it had at the restaurant, almost confident. He mentioned that Claudia would be there and that they both appreciated the chance to talk things through. I listened patiently, letting him speak, hearing the quiet certainty in his tone. Daniel had always believed that conversations ended the way he expected them to end. It was a habit he developed over the years while working in sales, where confidence often opened doors faster than caution. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the kitchen counter and looked toward the dining table where the folder from Thomas Reed's office remained exactly where I had left it. I had opened it several times during the week, reading through Robert's careful instructions again and again. Each time I did, I could almost hear his calm voice explaining the logic behind every decision. Robert did not believe in surprises. He believed in preparation. The morning of the meeting arrived with clear blue skies and the warm air of early spring moving gently through the neighborhood. I dressed simply, choosing the same navy coat I had worn many times before. Robert used to say that steady appearances help people underestimate how much you were thinking. The drive downtown felt familiar and calm. Traffic moved slowly along High Street as commuters filled the sidewalks with the quiet energy of a weekday morning. By the time I reached the office building where Thomas Reed worked, I felt completely at ease. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and directed me toward the conference room where Thomas was already waiting. The room looked exactly as it had the week before, a long wooden table, a wide window overlooking the city, and the same folder resting neatly near the center. Thomas nodded as I entered, offering the quiet reassurance of someone who understood the importance of patience. "They should be here shortly," he said. I thanked him and took a seat near the end of the table. The minutes passed quietly until footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. A moment later the door opened, and Daniel stepped inside with Claudia beside him. Daniel wore a confident expression, the same one I had seen countless times when he believed he was walking into a successful negotiation. Claudia followed closely, dressed neatly and carrying herself with the calm composure of someone who believed everything was already going according to plan. Daniel greeted Thomas with a firm handshake before turning toward me with a polite but distant smile. "I am glad we are all here," he said. Claudia nodded politely and took a seat beside him. For a few seconds the room remained quiet as everyone settled into their chairs. Outside the window the city moved steadily beneath the bright morning sun. Inside the conference room, however, time seemed to slow down as Thomas reached forward and gently opened the folder that had been waiting on the table. Daniel leaned slightly closer, curiosity in his eyes. Claudia watched calmly, her expression thoughtful but confident. I folded my hands together and waited. After all, patience had always been Robert's strongest lesson, and the moment we had prepared for was finally beginning. Thomas adjusted the folder slightly and began speaking in the calm professional tone that had guided Robert's business decisions for decades. The room grew quiet enough that even the faint sound of traffic outside seemed distant. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows lightly on the table as if preparing for a routine discussion about paperwork. Claudia sat beside him with the same composed expression she had worn since entering the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Thomas opened the first document and looked directly at Daniel before speaking. He explained that Robert Hayes had placed the majority of his estate, including the house, the remaining company shares, and several investment accounts, into a legally structured trust nearly 2 years before his passing. Daniel nodded slowly, clearly recognizing parts of this information from previous conversations, but assuming the outcome would eventually benefit him. Thomas continued without raising his voice, carefully outlining how the trust functioned. He explained that all operational authority over the trust had been assigned entirely to Margaret Hayes for the duration of her lifetime. This meant every financial decision, property matter, and investment adjustment remained under my sole direction. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his confidence still intact, but now mixed with curiosity. Claudia listened silently, watching Thomas with careful attention. Thomas then turned to the next page in the folder and paused for a moment before continuing. His voice remained steady but slightly firmer as he explained that Robert had included a specific protective clause within the trust structure. That clause addressed the treatment of Margaret Hayes by any direct heir. The language Robert used was precise and unmistakably clear. If any heir demonstrated deliberate disrespect, manipulation, coercion, or attempts to pressure Margaret regarding financial control or inheritance, that heir would immediately lose all rights to receive any portion of the estate. Daniel's posture stiffened slightly as Thomas read the sentence aloud. The air in the conference room seemed to grow heavier with each word. Claudia's expression remained composed, but the confident smile she carried earlier began to fade just enough to reveal careful concentration. Thomas finished reading the clause, and allowed the silence to settle for several seconds before continuing. He explained that Robert had also established a charitable foundation tied to the trust. Should the protective clause ever be triggered, the inheritance originally intended for the offending heir would be redirected entirely toward the foundation's scholarship program, supporting young apprentices entering skilled construction trades throughout Ohio. Daniel blinked slowly as the meaning of the clause began to settle in. He glanced briefly toward me, and then back to Thomas as if searching for some indication that the wording might be open to interpretation. Thomas calmly shook his head before Daniel even spoke. The clause had been written deliberately to leave no room for confusion. Claudia shifted slightly in her seat, her hands tightening together for a moment before she relaxed them again. Daniel cleared his throat quietly and asked whether the clause had ever been activated. Thomas answered carefully, explaining that enforcement of the clause depended entirely on Margaret Hayes and her judgment of the heir's behavior. All authority rested with me. The room grew still again as those words settled into place. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, his earlier certainty now replaced by a quieter, more cautious expression. Claudia finally turned her eyes toward me with a new kind of attention, the kind people use when they realize a conversation has shifted in a direction they had not expected. I remained seated with my hands folded calmly on the table, exactly as Robert had always done when negotiations reached their most important moment. Outside the large window, the city continued moving under the bright Ohio sun. But inside the conference room, the balance of understanding had quietly changed, and for the first time since that lunch at the restaurant, Daniel was beginning to realize that the future he believed was guaranteed had never truly belonged to him at all. The silence in the conference room lasted longer than anyone expected. Daniel sat with his hands resting on the table, staring at the documents Thomas had just read, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more comfortable. Claudia remained very still beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful expression that revealed she was now studying every detail of the situation with far greater attention. Thomas closed the folder slowly, but left it on the table where everyone could still see Robert's signature resting clearly at the bottom of the final page. For several seconds no one spoke. Outside the wide window, the traffic on High Street continued moving in steady lines beneath the bright Ohio sun. But inside the room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel finally cleared his throat and looked toward me, his voice quieter than it had been at the restaurant days earlier. He said he had not realized the estate had been structured in that way, and that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding between us. I listened patiently without interrupting, allowing him the time he seemed to need to gather his thoughts. Claudia leaned slightly closer to him and spoke in a calm voice, suggesting that the family could still work things out if everyone remained reasonable. Her tone was polite but careful, the tone of someone who had quickly recognized that the conversation was no longer moving in the direction she once expected. I folded my hands gently on the table and looked from Daniel to Claudia before speaking. My voice remained calm, steady, and measured in the same way Robert had always spoken when important decisions needed to be explained. I told them that Robert had spent his entire life building stability not only for himself, but for the people he loved. The trust he created was never meant to punish anyone. It was meant to ensure that respect within the family remained as important as financial success. Daniel listened closely now, the confident posture he carried earlier replaced by something far more cautious. I reminded him that Robert believed character revealed itself most clearly during moments of pressure. The clause Thomas had just read existed for a simple reason. Robert wanted to protect the foundation of our family from being shaped by impatience or entitlement. Claudia looked down briefly at the table before lifting her eyes toward me again, clearly weighing every word that had been spoken. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice more careful now as he asked whether the clause had already been activated. The room grew quiet again as Thomas glanced toward me, signaling that the answer belonged entirely to my decision. I took a slow breath and allowed the moment to settle before responding. I explained that Robert had trusted me to decide when respect had been broken and when it had not. That responsibility had never been something I treated lightly. For a moment Daniel seemed ready to speak again, but the words did not come immediately. Instead he sat back in his chair, looking from me to Thomas and then to the folder once more. The confidence that had once carried him through the lunch conversation was gone now, replaced by a quiet awareness that the situation was far more serious than he had believed. Claudia remained silent beside him, her thoughtful expression suggesting that she understood the importance of the moment even if she had not expected to face it. I rested my hands calmly on the table and looked directly at my son, remembering the young boy who once rode his bicycle down our quiet street, while Robert jogged beside him offering steady encouragement. Life had changed since those days, but the lessons Robert believed in had not. Respect, patience, and responsibility were the values he had built everything upon. And as the quiet sunlight filled the conference room that morning, Daniel was finally beginning to understand that those values had been written not only into Robert's life, but also into the future he had carefully prepared. I looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking again, allowing the quiet of the room to carry the weight of the decision that had already formed in my mind. Outside the tall window, the sunlight had shifted slightly, casting long reflections across the polished conference table where Robert's documents rested between us. My son sat across from me with a seriousness I had not seen in his face for many years, and beside him Claudia remained still, her attention focused entirely on my next words. I told Daniel that Robert had always believed respect was the foundation of every family decision. Without it, even the strongest structures eventually collapse. That was the reason the clause existed. Robert had not created it out of anger or suspicion. He created it because he understood that time sometimes reveals sides of people that even family members fail to see at first. Daniel listened without interrupting, the earlier confidence from the restaurant now replaced by careful restraint. I reminded him that when we sat down for lunch a week earlier, he had spoken with certainty about my worth, about the difference he believed existed between his mother and someone he had only recently welcomed into his life. I explained that those words had not caused anger inside me. Instead, they had clarified something Robert and I had quietly discussed many times before his passing. Robert understood that money can test character faster than any other challenge. That is why he had structured the trust in a way that placed responsibility before inheritance. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the table as he absorbed the meaning of what I was saying. Claudia remained silent beside him, her earlier composure now replaced by a thoughtful stillness that suggested she finally understood the seriousness of the situation. I then explained the decision I had reached after reviewing Robert's documents and considering the events of the past week. The clause had not been written simply as a warning. It existed to protect the values Robert believed should guide our family long after he was gone. I told Daniel that when he raised his voice in that restaurant and declared that his own mother was worthless, he crossed the line Robert had described in the trust. It was not a mistake made in anger. It was a moment that revealed how easily respect could be replaced by entitlement when people believed money would solve every consequence. Thomas remained silent as I spoke, allowing the conversation to unfold exactly as Robert intended it to. Daniel looked up slowly, his expression now carrying the quiet realization that the path he had expected no longer existed. I explained that Robert's clause had now been formally activated. The inheritance Daniel once assumed would belong to him would instead follow the alternative path Robert had prepared. The foundation Robert created would receive those assets and use them to fund scholarships for young men and women entering skilled construction trades across Ohio, giving them the same opportunities Robert once worked so hard to build for himself. For several seconds no one spoke. The city continued moving outside the window as if unaware of the moment unfolding in the conference room. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of understanding settling across his expression. Claudia glanced briefly toward him and then toward the folder on the table, clearly realizing that Robert's preparation had left no space for negotiation. I gathered my purse calmly and stood from my chair. My voice remained steady as I spoke one final time. I told Daniel that worth is never measured by inheritance, property, or bank accounts. Worth is measured by the way a person treats the people who stood beside them long before success arrived. Robert understood that lesson better than anyone I had ever known. I thanked Thomas for his time and walked toward the door, leaving the conference room exactly as I had entered it earlier that morning. Outside, the bright Ohio sunlight filled the hallway, and for the first time since that afternoon at the restaurant, I felt the same quiet certainty Robert had carried through every chapter of his life. The future he had prepared was not built on anger or revenge. It was built on principle, and that foundation, unlike money, could never be taken for granted.